cuts are not smart. They are not fair. Emergency responders, like the ones who are here today, their ability to help communities respond to and recover from disasters will be degraded. Federal prosecutors will have to close cases and let criminals go. Air traffic controllers and airport security will see cutbacks. Hundreds of thousands of Americans will lose access to primary care and preventive care like flu vaccinations and cancer screenings. Thousands of teachers and educators will be laid off.
Sinister sequestration, Republican damnation, total obliteration, maximum frustration, likely the end of our nation. All right, I ran out of rhymes. Forget the cuts that are coming. Is this over-the-top, end-of-the-world stuff, if they do, getting more than a little unbecoming? And is using emergency workers as props to make a point, now making any attempt at reining in spending officially pointless? Look at the props. Look at our debt. Look at the $85 billion we are cutting. Look at the $3.5 trillion budget from which we are cutting it. And then I want you to ask yourself this. If this is the kind of reaction, cutting the equivalent of a rounding error on a rounding error gets you in Washington, what happens when we really have to get cutting in Washington? Today, we cut to the chase. Expect no cutting at all. Welcome, everybody. I'm Neil Cavuto. Well, they say that actions speak louder than words, so let's just say the president's actions on spending today leave me doubtful about his words on spending any day, because mark it down, he has given up. Those sequestration cuts on which he signed off are now deemed way off. What amounted to a backup backbone for Washington to come up with automatic cuts if they couldn't agree on at least some cuts is suddenly looking real. And to hear the president tell it, real dangerous as well. But again, ask yourself this. If cutting little more than 1% off the growth of our budget creates such a stink, my oh my, how could we ever make progress cutting a more than $16 trillion debt that now reeks? To Michelle Malkin, who's been smelling this rat for a long time. You know, Michelle, this is incredible. What do you make of this?
It is. This is the court jester of Sequester. I think that this press conference was a national embarrassment. Damnation, condemnation. Get your rhyming dictionary.
Well, those are pretty good because you had a couple more rhymes than I did. I ran out of them. But, I mean, he signed on to these cuts knowing that they were sort of the backup plan, as did Republicans, I might point out. So this feigned shock and awe about what we're facing really raises the question, well, why did you come up with them in the first place?
Right. It's not just that he signed on to them. He was the author. I mean, we know from Bob Woodward, of course, that the whole idea of sequestration was Barack Obama's idea. He didn't think that the Republicans would go along with this. He was expecting them to fold. But there are a lot of responsible fiscal conservatives who understood that they needed to prove that even they could stomach some of these defense cuts because they had to show that they were serious about reigning in government. And yet here we go again with the chicken little in chief surrounding himself with these human shields, the first responders, and wailing and moaning and shrieking about Republicans wanting to...
And by the way, who says that they have to be the first areas in which you do cut? And by the way, how does this jibe with what you've said in the past, Mr. President, about your resolve to deal with the budget deficit? I just want you to listen to this, Michelle.
I refuse to leave our children with a debt that they cannot repay. Our prosperity also depends on our ability to pay down the massive debt we've accumulated over the past decade in a way that allows us to meet our responsibilities to each other and to the future. If we don't act, that burden will ultimately fall on our children's shoulders. If we don't act, the growing debt will eventually crowd out everything else. And all of us agree we've got to pay down our debt. We've got to make sure that we're living within our means.
Well, that was then. This is now. Where do we stand now?
Well, of course, the lips say to save the children, but the actions say screw the children. I mean, at the same time that we're talking about a 2.4% cut in the 2013 budget, this tiddlywinks $85 billion, that's not really a cut. Can we put that in ghost quotes every time they say it? You underscored that at the top of your remarks there. But at the same time that he's talking about that, what did he just do? They just signed $60 billion in pork-laden Hurricane Sandy spending that has no offsets to it.
Well, and also in a State of the Union address in which he proposed hundreds of billions of dollars worth of additional spending, promising that it won't add a dime to our deficit, which raises the issue the only way to pay for it is more taxes. But I digress on that point. The bigger point now is what happens, because in the scheme of things, as you rightly pointed out, Michelle, I don't care if you're right or left on this issue, $85 billion in a $3.8 trillion budget is not a lot. And in the scheme of what's going to be likely 10 years from now, at a minimum, a $20 trillion debt, a rounding error on a rounding error on a rounding error. So if we are fighting and guffawing with this, what are we going to do when we really have to put the pedal to the metal? If we do.
Right, and that's where I think strategically the Republicans really need to push back hard on this. It's an educational mission and it's an evangelical mission to get people to open their eyes to the real crisis here. You know, the message from these Democrats over the last couple of weeks has been, it's very coordinated. The world will end if we don't spend. And of course, that has it completely backwards, right? Because it's because of all this spending that we are facing an apocalypse. They've been kicking the can down the road. We're 10 days away now from these looming sequestration cuts. And instead of swallowing it and sucking it up and finally paying some consequences, what is Obama doing? He's blaming us for taking away primary care physicians and endangering the national security of every man, woman, and child in America.
Well, I got to say, and you pointed out at the beginning, Michelle, quite appropriately, both sides came up with these sequestration cuts, in fact, tilted heavily toward defense cuts, was a White House idea to try to compel Republicans to do something, and then to express shock that it's coming to pass is just too much.
Yes.
Too much. Thank you, Michelle. Great seeing you again.
You bet.